Tonight, we walk past locked doors and whispering stone. Dust lifts in the lamplight, tracing the edges of maps that should not exist. Ink glows like embers, drawing coastlines no one was meant to see. Across centuries, a handful of maps have stirred quiet storms. They show coasts buried under ice and lands across the ocean long before Columbus. In guarded rooms and sealed drawers, they slept until a few copies slipped into the world. This audiobook moves through those rooms. We follow the ink, the parchment, and the hands that hid them. We begin in medias res, a table, a lamp, a chart with a southern continent drawn with clean bays and capes. Antarctica, centuries early. The question is not only, is it real, but why hide it? We won't shout, we will trace. We'll meet sailors whose names were erased, scholars who copied what they did not dare to say, and clergy who stamped silence on paper that spoke too loudly. You'll hear of portolan charts that mapped winds better than we do, of the Piri Reis fragment stitched from older sources, of the Orontius Phineus sheet that sketched rivers under ice. We'll pause at the Vinland map, contested, tested, and still unsettling. We'll step into the Vatican's deep stacks where notes say, consult only with permission, and we'll ask a calm, clean question each time. What if the past was less blind than we think? This is not a chase scene. It is a quiet walk with open eyes. We'll hold both wonder and doubt. Where evidence is strong, we'll say so. Where legend rises, we'll mark it. And when a map points to a truth too large for one story, we'll let the ocean speak, patient, steady, and very old. The lamp flickers in a room that smells of paper and dust. The table beneath it is heavy oak, its surface worn smooth by centuries of hands leaning in too close. On the parchment, pale lines emerge under the glow coastlines traced with ink that should not exist. They curve where no hand should have known to draw, shaping a southern landmass centuries before explorers would arrive. Antarctica, whispered into being long before its discovery, lies there as if it had been waiting all along. No explanations are written on the page, no bold title declares what the map claims, only the silent curve of bays and capes, the suggestion of rivers, the outline of something vast. It is both familiar and impossibly out of place. This is where the story begins, not in a grand hall or a bustling port, but in a room of shadows, where parchment carries truths too delicate for daylight. The Vatican archives are built like a labyrinth. High stone walls, locked cabinets, endless corridors of silence. To step inside is to step into a vault of memory. Not every shelf is meant for eyes beyond the guardians of the place. Some drawers are opened only by those who carry keys, not of metal, but of authority. It is in such drawers, according to whispers, that maps like these were placed. Maps that tell of coasts drawn before explorers touched their shores. Maps that challenge the tidy order of history books. The question is not only how the maps were made, but why they were hidden. A coastline centuries too early unsettles more than geography. It unsettles power. For the mapmaker, accuracy was survival. A sailor who miscalculated a bay lost his ship. A captain who drew a false current endangered his crew. Yet here, accuracy runs ahead of time itself, as if the mapmaker saw through the ice. To acknowledge such a thing is to acknowledge that the past may hold more eyes than we admit, eyes that saw farther or remembered deeper than we imagine. The candle sputters, shadows climb the walls. In the quiet, the map continues to speak without sound. Its ink has outlived kings, storms, empires, and wars. It carries its lines forward, waiting for someone to notice. To open such a page is to feel both wonder and unease. If this is true, what else has been lost? And if it is not, why does it look so certain? Here, at the threshold of the book, we do not rush to answer. We linger instead on the lamp, the table, the parchment spread wide. For the map is not only paper, it is an invitation. An invitation to walk beyond accepted stories, into silence, into shadows, and to follow ink where it should never have been. The silence of the room is not empty. It hums like a low tide withdrawing, a silence that does not erase questions but makes them louder. This is the silence that guarded the map for centuries, the silence that weighed heavier than words. Step closer, trace the line, feel the unease. History may be older than we have been told. And so the map rests, still speaking across time. We lean closer, and the lamp grows brighter. The story begins here. In monasteries, silence was more than a discipline. It was law. Rooms filled with the sound of quills scratching parchment, but voices did not rise. A scribe's duty was to copy, not to question. Every stroke of ink was obedience. Yet, within these quiet halls, secrets passed not in words but in lines. A map in a monk's hand was not just geography. It was theology, politics, survival. To chart the world was to chart God's creation, to sketch borders where kingdoms met, to mark seas where souls might be found or lost. But what happened when the world drawn on parchment stretched further than doctrine allowed? Margins tell us more than main text. On some maps, faint notes appear from older chart, copied without source. Do not share. They are whispers, small enough to escape attention, large enough to reveal intent. In these margins lives the shadow of forbidden knowledge, knowledge a scribe could not erase, yet dared not announce. Imagine the scribe's hand hesitating. A coastline curves south where doctrine holds only ocean. The ink trembles, but the line is drawn. Perhaps he copied faithfully from a template already ancient. Perhaps he added what he was told, trusting authority. Or perhaps, in silence, he wondered if he should stop. The oath he carried was heavier than curiosity. To question was to betray. To copy was to obey. And so he obeyed, binding truth in ink, burying doubt in silence. The Church understood power was not only in scripture, but in maps. To know the world was to claim it. To decide what could be shown was to decide what could exist. A forbidden coastline could not simply be destroyed. It had to be contained. Locked in drawers, stamped with seals, whispered of, but never spoken aloud. The oath of silence protected more than theology. It protected the stability of kingdoms, the authority of priests, the fragile walls of belief. What might collapse if sailors whispered of a southern land seen too early, or a western shore already known? Silence was safer than debate. Silence was order. And so the ink survived, hidden under oath, a coastline, copied again and again, carried forward by scribes who never spoke of it. Each stroke added another layer of secrecy, another weight of silence. The lines became ghosts on paper present, undeniable yet unseen. Today, when we look at these maps, we see not only coastlines, but choices. Choices made by those who wrote them, choices made by those who locked them away. The oath was never broken. It was simply forgotten, as silence stretched into centuries. The ink remains, the silence remains, and the oath, though invisible, still breathes between the lines. Spread a portolan chart across a table, and it looks alive. Lines radiate from compass points, crisscrossing like spider silk. Bays curve with precision. Harbours nestle in exact proportion. The parchment almost hums with purpose. These maps, born in the Mediterranean centuries ago, carried sailors across seas with a confidence that feels strangely modern. Their beauty lies in accuracy. Without satellites, without longitude, without modern tools, the chartmakers drew coastlines so true that modern eyes still pause. How? They knew harbours by heart, winds by pattern, stars by rhythm. Knowledge passed mouth to mouth, ship to ship, until it settled in ink. But sometimes the portolans whisper of more. A cape that juts further south than it should, a coastline that stretches longer than records suggest. Details that hint at lands beyond known reach. Most of these maps hold only what sailors needed. Yet in their bones, some carry shadows of places unexplained. To read a portolan is to trace memory itself. Each line is a voyage remembered, each symbol a harbour trusted. The compass roses bloom across the page like constellations brought down to earth. The maps were not theory, they were survival tools. A misplaced river meant lost ships, and yet, somehow, accuracy runs deeper than expected. In some cases, it runs centuries too deep. The Vatican guarded collections of these charts. Sailors sold copies, merchants commissioned them, but originals with curious details found their way into locked rooms. A chart showing a land too early was not destroyed, but it was not allowed to spread. Better to hold it, to study it, to decide later what it meant. The bones of portolans remind us, maps were living things. They grew with each voyage, each story carried back across the sea. But sometimes a detail entered that had no voyage attached. No logbook, no record, no known ship. Just a line, just a shape. Imagine a sailor whispering of a land glimpsed on a storm-tossed horizon. Imagine a fragment of an older chart, copied without question. Imagine memory stretching farther than belief allowed. These possibilities hang in the silence of portolans. The compass roses point outward, but the mystery points inward, not toward the sea, but toward the hidden rooms where such maps were held. Toward the hands that traced coastlines with care, yet never explained how they knew. The bones of portolans show precision, but also omission. What they do not say is louder than what they do. The parchment rustles softly under a hand. The roses bloom, the coastlines curve. The spiderweb lines whisper of journeys long past. In the silence, we are left with the same question as the sailors who once leaned over these maps. What lies just beyond the edge? The parchment is never whole. Edges fray, corners darken, ink fades where the fold has pressed too long. What remains is fragmentary, like a voice carried through fog. And yet, from these pieces, an entire world once emerged. Cartographers worked not from nothing, but from scraps, sailors' notes, port records, rumours of coastlines half seen. When the pieces were gathered, the mapmaker stitched them together with lines. One bay here, another headland there. A river recalled from memory, a shoreline guessed from the swell of waves. The fragments became a mosaic, not always perfect, but alive. In the fragments lies a paradox. They are incomplete, but sometimes they show too much. A coastline appears far too accurately for its time. A landmass emerges where no voyage is recorded. It is as if the mapmaker worked from a memory that was older than himself, older than the kingdom that paid him, older than the faith that oversaw his work. These are not inventions of the imagination, they are too precise for that. They are echoes, carried forward from older maps that no longer exist. Scholars call this layering of sources palimpsest cartography. One map is copied into another, and another, until the original fades into absence. What survives is not a clean picture, but a shadow. Something remembered, something repeated, but without a source to anchor it. This is how fragments outlive their origins. Imagine a merchant arriving at a Mediterranean port with a scrap of sheepskin. On it, a jagged coast is sketched with surprising accuracy. No names, no compass roses, just the outline of land. He hands it to a cartographer, who copies it into a larger work, careful not to lose the curve. The merchant disappears, the scrap vanishes, but the line remains. Centuries later, the line still curves across a map. Historians study it and wonder who first saw it, whose eyes traced that coast, whose hand marked that river mouth. The fragment carries no answer, only its stubborn presence. The Vatican understood the weight of fragments. A single coastline could open questions too wide. So fragments were catalogued, stored, sometimes hidden. Better to preserve the piece than to risk the storm it might cause. A fragment could not be denied, it was too small, too precise, but it could be contained. And so the fragments pile up. A southern shore drawn before ice, a western land outlined before Columbus, a river marked with accuracy no sailor should have known. Each fragment on its own could be dismissed as error. Together, they whisper of something older, something larger. The silence around them is deliberate. When asked, curators speak of errors, embellishments, guesswork. Perhaps they are right, but the fragments persist. The maps refuse to erase them. The coastlines curve, the rivers flow, the fragments remain. In fragments, history hides, not in bold declarations, but in quiet lines carried forward by obedience. The truth is never whole, never clear, but always waiting. A fragment of a larger world, always there, always asking, what if the world was known before it was discovered? The room grows quiet. A finger traces a line that should not be there. The fragment speaks, and the silence grows heavier. It is only a piece of a map, not a whole chart, not a complete globe, but a fragment of leather showing a portion of the world. The date, 1513. The maker, Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer. The puzzle, what he drew and what he claimed about his sources. On the surviving fragment, the coastlines of South America sweep down with surprising accuracy. Islands dot the Atlantic, some real, some imagined. At the bottom, a landmass appears, broad, southern, cold. Some say it resembles Antarctica, others say it is merely an extended South America. But the puzzle lies not in what it shows, but in what Piri Reis himself wrote. In his own notes, the admiral claimed he used older sources, charts from sailors long gone, maps from lands conquered, knowledge passed down from forgotten hands. He mentions Columbus among them, but also other maps, strange ones, ancient ones. He did not name them, but he leaned on them. He did not invent. He copied, and in copying, he preserved something the world was not ready to see. If his words are true, then Piri Reis held in his hand fragments of maps older than Europe's age of discovery, fragments that whispered of coasts drawn centuries before. To acknowledge this is to step into silence, for it suggests that the New World was not new, that Antarctica was not hidden. The fragment itself is not perfect. It distorts, it guesses, it stretches. But within its flaws lies something unsettling. Precision where there should be none. Harbours marked too well, distances too close to truth, coastlines too smooth for guesswork. It is as if someone, long before, had walked those shores or sailed those seas. The Vatican did not ignore this fragment. Copies reached Europe, whispers spread, but the Church held its silence. If older maps existed, where did they come from? Who made them? And what did that say about the order of history? To entertain these questions was to risk unravelling the narrative of discovery, the sanctity of beginnings, the authority of institutions. The puzzle of Piri Reis lies not only in geography, but in testimony. The Admiral's note, calm and clear, I used older charts, now lost. That statement alone is enough to open a door that has never closed. Scholars today debate, dismiss, or defend. Some say the southern land is not Antarctica at all, merely a misdrawn coast. Others see beneath the ice, rivers that match geology hidden until the 20th century. The arguments stretch long, but the puzzle remains. Why would Piri Reis invent a claim of older maps? Why risk credibility with stories of forgotten charts? The answer is silence. He did not seek to invent, he sought to preserve. His oath was to accuracy, his loyalty to the sea. The maps he copied spoke more than he could explain, and so he let them speak. The puzzle of Piri Reis is not solved. It lingers, like ink that refuses to fade. The fragment survives, the coastlines remain, the note endures. A puzzle, carried forward in silence, waiting for eyes willing to see. In 1531, a French cartographer named Orontius Phineas drew a world map. It was large, detailed, ornate. But at the bottom, below Africa, below South America, he sketched a vast southern land, not blank, not guessed, but drawn with bays, capes, and rivers. A land that looked unsettlingly like Antarctica 3 centuries before explorers confirmed it. The map survives in crisp detail. Rivers flow across the southern landmass, mountains rise, coastlines curve. Some of these features, when compared to modern surveys beneath the ice, align with surprising closeness. Too close, some argue, to be coincidence. The land Orontius Phineas drew was not the frozen wasteland we know. It was a continent outlined as if seen free of ice. The puzzle deepens. In 1531, no one had seen Antarctica. The southern seas were uncharted, the cold too fierce, the distance too vast. And yet, here on parchment, the land lies open, its rivers traced like veins. How did he know? Orontius Phineas gave no clear answer. He drew what he believed, what his sources provided. Like Piri Reis, he may have worked from older maps. He may have copied fragments passed quietly through hands, each bearing pieces of a larger memory. His name is not whispered with mystery like others. He was a cartographer, a craftsman doing his work. But his southern land refuses to be ignored. Some dismiss the resemblance as chance. Shapes bend, rivers wander, maps distort. But the alignment unsettles. Features under ice match features on his map. The possibility is not proof, but it is enough to draw silence from those who guard the narrative. The Vatican stored maps like his. Copies circulated, but originals found their way into locked drawers. To display a southern continent so early was to risk opening questions that had no answer. Who first saw it? How old was the knowledge? Why had it been buried? Silence was safer. The Orontius Phineas map sits today in archives, studied, debated, doubted. But its southern shape endures. The rivers still flow across parchment, the mountains still rise in ink. They do not vanish with doubt, nor fade with dismissal. They remain stubborn and quiet, like truth itself. To lean over the map is to feel a strange sensation, as if the ice itself is whispering. To see rivers where there should be none, to trace coastlines that should not exist, is to feel the weight of time pressing back. Perhaps someone saw Antarctica long ago. Perhaps memory travelled further than history admits. Or perhaps, in the silence of archives, we are staring at an echo of a world forgotten. The lamp flickers, the southern land lies open, the silence remains. The map speaks, and the southern shape waits for someone to listen. The 18th century was an age of certainty. Maps grew confident, coastlines solidified, and the unknown shrank under the pressure of explorers returning with charts. Yet within this atmosphere of reason, one cartographer drew something unsettling. His name was Philippe Bouache. His map was of the southern world, and on it appeared channels running beneath the ice of Antarctica, channels no one in his time could have known. Bouache was no mystic. He was a geographer, methodical and precise, a man trained to weigh evidence. His maps were celebrated for their clarity, their logic, their attempt to explain land not yet seen. He worked with fragments, reports, rumours, and the best science of his day. But when he turned his gaze south, he drew what seemed impossible, a divided Antarctica, split into islands, joined by channels that cut through where we now know ice lies thick and heavy. The puzzle sharpens when compared with modern surveys. In the 20th century, when aircraft and satellites pierced the veil of ice, scientists found that beneath the frozen sheet, Antarctica is indeed divided, its landmass fractured, waterways running between. The channels Bouache traced centuries earlier align with surprising closeness to reality. Did he guess? Did he reason from currents and winds, from floating icebergs hinting at unseen rivers? Perhaps. Bouache himself claimed his work came from ancient sources, fragments inherited from maps long gone. He believed knowledge survived in pieces, copied across generations, and that his task was not to invent but to reconstruct. His map feels like an echo, too accurate to dismiss, too early to explain. When it first appeared, it unsettled his peers. How could a man chart waterways beneath ice no one had crossed? The Vatican, already cautious of southern maps, would have seen in Boache's work not just speculation, but danger. A land drawn before it was discovered threatened the fragile timeline of history, the ordered narrative of discovery and conquest. Better to set such maps aside than to risk their implications. Boache left no confession of invention. His lines were drawn with confidence, his notes calm. He was not a dreamer scribbling fantasy. He was a cartographer who believed he was recovering forgotten truths. His hidden channels remain, drawn centuries before modern science confirmed them, a reminder that fragments of knowledge sometimes outlive the memory of their origin. When we look at Boache's southern map, we are not only looking at his skill, but at a mystery that stretches back further. If he was right, then someone long before him must have known. Someone must have seen, measured, remembered. And if that someone existed, then our story of discovery is incomplete. The parchment rests quietly. The channels trace their course, flowing across time. They wait, patient and certain, for the ice to melt and reveal whether Boache's hand was guided by reason, guesswork, or memory carried from a world we have forgotten. The map is round, sprawling across parchment like a tapestry. Fra Mauro, a Venetian monk of the 15th century, spent years creating it. He gathered stories from sailors, merchants, pilgrims, and travellers, weaving their words into coastlines. His world is alive with detailed mountains, cities, rivers, and notes written in careful script. It is a map of geography, but also of memory. Unlike others, Fra Mauro did not confine himself to doctrine. He listened. He drew what he heard, even when it clashed with accepted beliefs. His map shows Africa circumnavigable before Europeans had sailed its cape. It suggests knowledge of lands far to the west, across the Atlantic, hinted at in whispers and rumours. The world on his parchment is not flat, not confined, but expansive. Fra Mauro's notes are as important as his coastlines. In the margins, he wrote of voyages by unknown sailors who circled the globe. He spoke of islands in distant oceans, of lands not yet claimed by European crowns. These were not fantasies. He was careful, cautious, weighing sources, but he allowed memory its place, preserving stories others might have silenced. The roundness of his world was radical. At a time when many clung to limited geographies, Fra Mauro dared to depict the globe as a sphere interconnected by seas. His map is less a tool for navigation than a window into a consciousness that accepted a larger, older memory of the earth. The Vatican did not ban his work. Instead, they admired its artistry while quietly controlling its reach. To show Africa's cape as passable before official discovery was unsettling. To hint at western lands before Columbus was dangerous. Fra Mauro's round world spoke of a truth that might destabilize the careful narrative of exploration. And yet, the map survived. Its beauty protected it. Its artistry disarmed its challenge. Scholars could admire its detail without acknowledging its implications. But in the silence of archives, Fra Mauro's notes whisper still. If he was right, then sailors had gone further, earlier, than official history allows. If he was right, then memory carried across centuries found its way into his pen. The roundness of Fra Mauro's world is more than shape. It is philosophy. It says the earth was known in ways we have forgotten, that seas were bridges, not barriers, that maps carry memory older than empires. His parchment is a quiet challenge, a reminder that knowledge need not wait for permission to exist. The map rests in its case, delicate but firm. Its round world gazes back at us, asking whether we will see only art, or whether we will hear the deeper memory etched into its lines. Few maps have stirred more controversy than the Vinland map. Thin, fragile, its ink traced a coastline that should not exist, a western land, labelled Vinland, drawn before Columbus set sail. When it surfaced in the 20th century, it ignited debate that has never settled. The map itself is modest, a simple sketch, medieval in style, with Europe, Africa, and Asia arranged in familiar patterns. But off to the west, beyond Greenland, lies a landmass marked Vinland. The name echoes Norse sagas, the stories of Leif Erikson and his voyages across the Atlantic. If true, the map was proof that knowledge of America existed centuries before Columbus. The Vatican, like many institutions, approached it cautiously. To admit its authenticity would unravel the official narrative of discovery. To dismiss it outright risked ignoring a fragment of truth. So it was studied, tested, doubted. Scientists examined its ink, its parchment, its style. Some tests declared it genuine medieval parchment, consistent script, ancient ink. Others raised alarms, traces of modern chemicals, inconsistencies in linework. The debate grew fierce, scholars dividing between believers and skeptics. Each argument deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. What makes the Vinland map so haunting is not only its disputed authenticity, but the possibility it represents. If genuine, it confirms that memory of America persisted in Europe centuries before Columbus. If false, it reveals the power of desire for proof, for validation, for a different story. Either way, the map exposes the fragility of our narratives. In archives, the Vinland map lies like a mirror. To some, it reflects deceit, a clever forgery. To others, it reflects forgotten truth, a trace of voyages erased from history. Its very existence unsettles. Even as scholars argue, the coastline remains, traced in quiet ink, indifferent to our doubts. The Vatican never proclaimed its verdict. Silence proved safer than certainty. To declare it real risked rewriting centuries of accepted history. To declare it false risked overlooking a fragment of truth. Better to let it rest, contested, unresolved, a map that raises questions louder than answers. And so it endures, fragile and defiant. Whether true or false, the Vinland map forces us to see the boundaries of history as uncertain. It reminds us that maps are not only records of land, but records of belief. And belief, like coastlines, shifts with time. The parchment trembles in its case, light catching the ink. Vinland lies west of Greenland, waiting. True or false, the map has already achieved its purpose. It has unsettled certainty. It has forced us to ask what we know and how we know it. The silence around it is thick, deliberate, a silence that protects, that postpones, that resists final judgment. But the map remains, whispering of voyages across seas, whether real or imagined, centuries before Columbus set sail. The parchment lies flat, but the words written upon it tell a different story. There is no America here, no neat label, no bold claim, no continent christened with the name of Vespucci. Instead, coastlines run unmarked, shapes curve without titles, and a great land rests silently to the west, unnamed and uncertain. Before the name, there was the shape, and the shape alone was enough to unsettle. When the first European maps of the 15th and early 16th centuries were drawn, some carried outlines that stretched across the ocean. A coast mirrored here, a cape there, sometimes connected to Asia, sometimes floating alone. They lacked labels, but they carried presence. Whoever copied them preserved more than rumour, they preserved memory. What had not yet been discovered already appeared as shape. Imagine leaning over such a map in a monastery scriptorium. The room is quiet, the air heavy with wax smoke, the page lit by a single candle. The scribe's hand traces a long western curve, copying it from an older sheet. He does not name it, for no name has been given. He does not question it, for his duty is to copy. And so the shape endures, carried forward through silence. The absence of a name does not mean absence of knowledge. On the contrary, it suggests that knowledge existed but was not ready to be spoken aloud. To give a place a name is to claim it, to declare authority over it. But to leave it blank is to admit both knowledge and uncertainty. We know something is there, the map whispers, but we cannot yet say what. The Vatican understood the power of naming, to allow a new continent to be labelled openly before official discovery would fracture order. Columbus had not yet sailed, or had only just returned. The political weight of naming a land across the ocean could not be borne by rumour or fragment, and so the shapes remained nameless, drifting on parchment like shadows. Later, when Vespucci's letters spread, the name America attached itself like a seal. Maps shifted, labels grew bolder, and the coastlines were baptized into certainty. But those earlier maps remain, showing the shapes before the names. They are evidence of knowledge without proclamation, of memory carried in silence, of discoveries hinted at long before they were declared. In these unnamed coasts lies the quiet suggestion that America was known before Columbus, not in the loud proclamations of empire, but in the whispered strokes of ink carried across centuries. The land did not need a name to exist. It simply waited, drawn in silence, until the world was ready to acknowledge it. Even now, when we study these maps, we feel the tension. The coastlines are there, but the names are not. The shapes are accurate, but the context is missing. They exist between knowledge and ignorance, between memory and proclamation. They remind us that discovery is not a single moment, but a slow unveiling, shaped as much by power as by truth. The candle flickers. The coastline stretches west. The parchment says nothing more, but in its silence, the truth is louder than any name. The coastline is drawn with care, each curve measured, each bay sketched, each river mouth marked with precision, yet no story accompanies it. No voyage recorded, no journal preserved, no captain's name attached. The shore exists on paper, but not in words. It is a coastline without a story. Maps are supposed to be narratives as much as tools. A sailor charts his route to remember the journey. A monarch commissions a map to declare dominion. But here, the coastlines stand alone, divorced from any tale. They are evidence without witness. How does a map remember what no one writes? In archives, such maps whisper unease. Scholars pore over them, comparing them to known voyages. No one should have been here at this time, they say, and yet the shoreline curves with stubborn accuracy. Was it guessed? Was it borrowed? Was it remembered from a voyage that never survived into text? The questions pile up, but the silence persists. The Vatican, keeper of both text and map, understood the imbalance. A coastline without a story was dangerous. A written account can be challenged, dismissed, corrected. A line on a map resists denial. It exists without explanation, forcing the mind to fill the gap. And so these maps were often hidden, their silent coastlines too unsettling to share. Imagine a scholar in the 17th century unrolling such a parchment. His eyes follow a coastline he cannot place. He turns to the archives, searching for a log, a letter, a testimony. Nothing. The coast exists only in ink. He closes the parchment, unsettled, and places it back into its drawer. The storyless shore remains, unchallenged but unacknowledged. Some suggest these coastlines were the product of guesswork. Mapmakers, piecing together rumours, sketched what might exist beyond known waters. Others insist they are fragments of older maps, preserved without their context. Either way, the result is the same, land drawn with care, but no words to explain it. The silence around these shores is heavier than any testimony. It forces us to confront the possibility that knowledge existed outside the neat record of history, that voyages were made, but never remembered in ink and paper, that the ocean carried sailors whose names we will never know, but whose journeys left traces on maps that outlived them. To walk through the archives is to see these shores waiting. They demand explanation, but receive none. They hold their silence, just as they have for centuries. And in that silence lies the possibility that our story of discovery is incomplete. The coastline curves across parchment. No story follows it. But the line itself is enough. It whispers louder than words. A coastline traced beneath ice, rivers flowing where none should be, mountains rising where the surface shows only frozen white. These are the lines that appear on certain ancient maps lines, that align with features buried under Antarctica's ice sheet, hidden for millennia. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531 is the most famous, but it is not alone. Other fragments, scattered across archives, hint at similar knowledge. They sketch rivers that match subglacial flows, capes that mirror the true coastline, bays that vanish under ice today. How could such lines be drawn in an age when Antarctica lay untouched? Science tells us the ice has covered the continent for thousands of years. No human in recorded history could have walked its shores free of ice, and yet the maps persist. They suggest a memory older than history, preserved in fragments that somehow reached medieval and Renaissance cartographers. Some dismiss the resemblance as coincidence. Ink stretches, parchment warps, coastlines shift, but the alignments are too sharp to ignore. When modern surveys confirm rivers under the ice that match lines drawn centuries earlier, coincidence begins to feel like evasion. The Vatican held such maps quietly. To admit them was to admit the possibility of a forgotten epoch, of knowledge that predates accepted history. If someone once mapped Antarctica free of ice, who were they? When did they live? How was their knowledge preserved? These questions carry weight heavy enough to fracture the narrative of human progress. Imagine a cartographer in the 16th century holding a fragment of an older chart. He does not understand its source, but he trusts its precision. He copies the lines faithfully, never suspecting he is drawing rivers that lie beneath thousands of years of ice. To him, it is simply information, carried forward without explanation. To us, it is a riddle. The silence surrounding these maps is deliberate. Better to let them gather dust than to invite speculation that cannot be contained. Better to dismiss them as errors than to admit they may point to a deeper truth. Silence is safer than curiosity, and yet the lines remain. They persist across centuries, etched into parchment that refuses to decay. They whisper of knowledge that does not fit neatly into history's boxes. They suggest that someone, long before us, saw Antarctica differently. The lamp flickers. The map lies open. The rivers beneath the ice trace their course across time, carrying questions heavier than the frozen continent itself. The lines do not vanish. They remain silent but insistent, waiting for us to listen. A sailor does not need parchment to know the world. He watches the flight of birds at dusk, feels the pull of the current against his hull, marks the rise of constellations that return each season. The sea itself is the first map, and memory the ink that writes upon it. Long before compasses and charts, long before printed atlases, men crossed oceans with nothing but the wind, the current, and the star. Stand on the deck of a small vessel in the open Atlantic. The sky above is sharp with light, each star a point of direction. The Milky Way arches like a path across the heavens, a bridge sailors learn to follow. Beneath, the water carries a rhythm, swells rolling from a steady direction that can guide as surely as any compass. The wind shifts with seasons, steady in its patterns, announcing when it is safe to sail and when it is time to wait. To read these signs is to hold the world's map in your body. Cultures across the globe mastered this art. Polynesian wayfinders navigated thousands of miles across the Pacific with no chart but the night sky. West African sailors rode the Canary Current northward and westward, its pull steady and strong. Norse mariners tracked the sun's arc, even on cloudy days, using crystals to catch its hidden rays. Each carried knowledge older than writing, knowledge preserved in the body, passed mouth to mouth, hand to hand, voyage to voyage. Now imagine fragments of these oral maps carried into Europe. A trader whispers of currents that carry ships beyond the horizon. A missionary listens to island navigators speak of lands far off. A sailor returns from a storm, with stories of birds flying from the west when no land is marked there. These fragments are memory without text, knowledge without record, but they filter slowly into charts. A coastline appears here, a cape there, drawn not from official discovery, but from whispers carried by sailors who trusted the sea more than parchment. The Vatican archives hold not only maps but testimony. Reports of voyages, letters from missionaries, fragments of sailors' tales. Many never reached the light of public record. They were filed, noted, sometimes locked away. To admit too much knowledge of lands beyond the known world before the right moment was to risk authority, to invite doubt, safer to wait. Safer to let silence do its work. And yet, maps betray memory. Even when stripped of names, even when devoid of stories, the coastlines drawn too early suggest that someone knew. Perhaps it was not a great expedition, but a lone vessel carried off course. Perhaps not a nation's fleet, but a merchant ship pushed by current and wind. Lost, returned, whispered, forgotten. But the star, the current, the wind, they carried the memory back. To study these maps is to sense the shadow of oral knowledge behind them. Lines too clean to be guesses, too precise to be fantasy. They feel like the imprint of journeys never written down, carried instead in the breath of sailors who measured the world by stars. In the silence of archives, the wind still stirs. The parchment is still, but its lines carry rhythm. A rhythm of current, a rhythm of memory, a rhythm of stars followed across seas long before discovery was declared. Knowledge rarely arrives whole. It comes in fragments, scraps of parchment, torn journals, rumours, half-remembered tales. A coastline drawn here, a cape there, a sailor's note preserved without context, a margin comment copied by habit. When gathered together, the pieces form a puzzle that hints at something larger. But in archives, the pieces are often scattered, filed apart, waiting for someone to assemble them. Walk the aisles of a great archive, and you feel this truth. On one shelf lies a Portolan chart with a southern cape drawn too far. On another rests a letter describing birds seen where no land is marked. In a drawer lies a fragment of parchment showing a western shore, unlabelled. Each alone feels trivial, dismissible, but together they whisper a memory that has outlived the stories meant to contain it. The Vatican archives are filled with such pieces. They were gathered across centuries, gifts from explorers, confiscated works, donations from dying scholars. They were catalogued with care, but not always connected. A fragment that challenged doctrine might be filed far from the chart that explained it. A note that contradicted official discovery might be left uncopied, unread. Knowledge survived, but in pieces. Why? Because fragments allow control. A full map showing America before Columbus could not be ignored, but a coastline here, a cape there, those could be dismissed as error, speculation, coincidence. By scattering the evidence, institutions could preserve the fragments without admitting the whole. Silence could be maintained, order preserved, and yet the pieces speak. Scholars who stumble across them sense a pattern. Why do maps from different centuries carry the same mistaken coastline? Why do unrelated fragments echo each other? Why does a river drawn in one chart match a feature hidden beneath ice in another? Coincidence bends under the weight of repetition. Imagine a cartographer in the 16th century copying a fragment without knowing its source. He trusts it because it looks precise. He incorporates it into his larger chart, unaware that another scribe centuries earlier copied the same line. Piece by piece, the fragments carry forward, surviving even as their origin fades. The story of forbidden maps is not the story of one document, but of many. Each piece is small, deniable, fragile. but together they form a mosaic of knowledge too consistent to ignore. The challenge lies in seeing the pattern. The silence of archives is both shield and challenge. Shield because it prevents disruption. Challenge because it forces us to assemble meaning from fragments scattered across centuries. But the fragments endure. They resist erasure. They wait for someone willing to gather them, to see the larger shape they form. Knowledge in pieces is still knowledge. A puzzle incomplete still reveals its image. In the end, the fragments are enough to whisper a truth the silence cannot bury. The world was known in ways we have forgotten. Keys hang heavy on iron rings, their weight more than metal. Each unlocks not just a door, but a decision. Who may enter? Who may see? Who may know? In the Vatican archives, the keepers of keys held power not through words or crowns, but through silence. Their duty was not to share knowledge, but to guard it. The archives are vast, stretching beneath and behind walls few ever pass. To enter is to pass thresholds guarded by men whose authority rests not on what they speak, but on what they refuse to reveal. The key keepers know which drawers hold forbidden maps, which cabinets contain charts drawn too early, which shelves carry knowledge that could fracture certainty. They do not study these works, they guard them. Their task is not interpretation, but preservation. Imagine the life of such a man. Each morning, he walks the aisles, checking locks, ensuring no parchment has been disturbed. He knows the locations of documents whispered about in rumours, but unseen by most scholars. He has handled maps that trace Antarctica before its discovery, charts that outline America without name, fragments that hint at forgotten voyages. Yet he does not speak. His oath is silence, his key a symbol of control. The key keepers serve more than the church. They serve order itself. To release knowledge at the wrong time is to risk chaos, challenges to doctrine, disruption of power, collapse of certainty. Better to guard than to reveal. Better to let a map gather dust than to invite a storm it cannot contain. Yet even key keepers are human. Some feel the weight of what they hold. A coastline drawn centuries too soon unsettles even the most disciplined mind. A chart, whispering of forgotten voyages, haunts even the most silent guardian. Some slip fragments into circulation, quietly, carefully. A copy finds its way to a scholar, a reproduction surfaces in a merchant's collection. These leaks are rare, but they explain how forbidden maps have survived at all. The Vatican does not erase, it withholds. Erasure risks scandal. Withholding allows control. A map locked in a drawer is not destroyed, it is silenced. But silence cannot last forever. Keys pass from hand to hand, guardians change, doors open and close. Sometimes, in these transitions, fragments escape. The key keepers stand at the threshold between knowledge and silence. They decide who enters, who sees, who remembers. Without them, forbidden maps might have vanished entirely. Because of them, the maps still exist, preserved in darkness. The ring of keys rattles softly in the silence of the archive. Each key opens a drawer where history waits, patient and mute. The keepers know what lies behind the locks. They guard it not with swords, not with arguments, but with silence. And silence, for centuries, has proved the strongest guard of all. Trade leaves trails, not just of goods, but of memory routes sketched in logbooks, ports etched into charts, harbours whispered in the margins of maps. Across centuries, these trails connected worlds long before empires rose to claim them. And yet, many of these routes disappeared, vanishing not into the sea, but into silence. Some were buried beneath conquest, some erased by politics, some simply forgotten. The coastlines remain, but the stories of the ships that touch them are gone. Imagine the Mediterranean in the 14th century. Ships sail east for spices, west for wool, north for furs, south for gold. But beyond the familiar, there are whispers of other paths. West African traders moving beyond the Canary Islands. Norsemen pushing across the Atlantic currents, merchants from the Levant carrying tales of great waters beyond. These stories leave traces on maps, fragments of coastlines that appear before their time, but the routes themselves vanish, swallowed by wars, by plague, by shifting empires. Knowledge often follows the tide of power. A port that flourished in one century can fall into ruin in the next. A route once rich with trade can fade when a kingdom collapses or a sea closes. When the storytellers vanish, the map becomes the only memory. And so we find coastlines without voyages, rivers without journals, ports without names. The trail of trade disappears, but its shadow lingers in ink. The Vatican, collecting maps across centuries, inherited these shadows. A chart might arrive bearing coastlines unfamiliar to the scholar who opened it. Questions would rise. Who sailed there, when and why? But without stories, without testimony, the answer was silence. Better to store the map than to admit ignorance. Better to lock away the routes than to allow speculation. Yet the maps themselves whisper persistence. A coastline of South America drawn before Columbus. A curve of Antarctica before explorers ever sighted it. These may not be evidence of official discovery, but they suggest memory carried across vanishing routes. A ship blown off course, a sailor carried westward, a trade path once active and later erased. When the route dies, the memory lingers. Trade routes vanish for many reasons. Empires fall, languages change, climate shifts. What once was possible becomes impossible, but the ocean remembers. The currents flow as they always have, carrying sailors to the same places, whether in the 10th century or the 20th. And when those sailors drew maps, they left echoes of vanished paths. Walk the aisles of the archive and you see them, fragments of maps that hint at lost routes. A river mouth on a chart with no name, a coastline drawn with precision but no story. These are the fossils of vanished trade, the remnants of journeys erased from history but preserved in silence. The silence is heavy, deliberate. To admit these roots is to admit that history is incomplete. To say the coastlines were known before Columbus, before Magellan, before Cook, is to unravel the story of discovery. Better to let the roots vanish than to risk rewriting the past. And so they remain hidden, guarded not by storms or reefs, but by silence itself. The sea, however, does not forget. Its currents still pull, its winds still guide, its stars still shine. The roots that vanished on paper still exist in the rhythm of the ocean. They wait, patient, whispering their memory through the coastlines preserved in forbidden maps. The order of the Knights Templar was dissolved in fire and secrecy, their wealth seized, their leaders executed, their ships vanished into rumour. Yet, in the centuries that followed, whispers persisted that the Templars carried not only gold, but knowledge, charts, routes, and maps that stretched further than official history allowed. Shadows of voyages long denied. The Templars were not merely soldiers. They were bankers, traders, sailors. Their fleets moved across the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, perhaps further. When their order was destroyed in the early 14th century, their ships were never accounted for. Some believe they sailed west, carrying both treasure and memory. Whether true or not, the absence of those ships is itself a silence that invites questions. In the Vatican archives, documents relating to the Templars remain sealed. Letters of excommunication, inventories of seized wealth, but also fragments of records never shown. Among them, whispers say, were maps, coastlines drawn beyond the known world. If such charts existed, they would not have been destroyed. They would have been locked away, kept safe in silence. The legend of the Templars grew because of absence. Where evidence is missing, imagination fills the gap. But imagination often clings to a kernel of truth. Could the Templars have inherited knowledge of routes across the Atlantic? Could they have preserved fragments of maps older than themselves? Their access to ports, their fleets, their networks make the idea less impossible than it seems. Imagine a Templar captain holding a chart that shows a western shore. Not a detailed map, but a suggestion, a coastline sketched from older fragments, a rumour-made ink. He guards it as treasure, not for gold, but for knowledge. When the order falls, he sails with it into silence. The ship vanishes, but the chart survives, hidden, past, eventually locked in drawers beneath Vatican walls. The shadows of the Templars reach far. Some see them in the stories of Columbus, who may have had access to fragments preserved in hidden collections. Others see them in porcelain maps that carry echoes of older knowledge. Whether true or myth, the persistence of the story speaks to a deeper unease. That knowledge existed in the hands of men who vanished, and that the silence that followed was deliberate. The Vatican's role in these shadows is complex. To preserve is to control, to deny is to protect. The Templars were condemned, but their knowledge, if they held any forbidden maps, would not have been destroyed. The Church has always guarded fragments of the world that did not fit its order. The Templar shadows may be among them. The silence remains. The ships vanished. The order fell. The archives closed. But the shadow of the Templars still stretches across forbidden maps. Whether myth or memory, their presence lingers like an echo in stone halls, whispering of voyages the world was never meant to know. When the Jesuits set sail as missionaries, they carried not only scripture but curiosity. Their letters back to Rome are filled with observations, languages, customs, stars, rivers, coastlines. They were priests, but they were also observers, scribes of a world far larger than the one their peers imagined. And in their reports, sometimes, lie hints of maps forbidden to the public. The Jesuits reached China, Japan, India, the Americas. They walked with rulers, sat in courts, sailed with merchants. They recorded what they saw, often in meticulous detail. A Jesuit in Beijing measured the heavens with Chinese astronomers. Another in Brazil described rivers that wound far inland. A third in Africa noted currents along the coast. These observations were sent back to Rome, often filed quietly into the Vatican archives. What makes their work unsettling is its precision. Jesuit reports sometimes described coastlines and stars with accuracy that rivaled the best cartographers of their day. And because their missions stretched across the globe, their collective knowledge resembled a map of the entire world long before such a map was admitted to exist. Imagine a Jesuit in the 17th century sitting at a desk in a remote mission. His ink-stained hands copy a coastline he has walked, a bay he has seen, a current he has measured. He sends it in a letter to Rome, where it is received, catalogued, and filed, not published, not shared, but preserved in silence. The information becomes part of a hidden archive of the world, built not by explorers seeking fame, but by priests sworn to obedience. Some maps in the Vatican archives bear marks of Jesuit hands. Marginal notes in Latin, comments about local names, corrections to coastlines. These small touches hint at a larger reality, that the Jesuits were quiet cartographers, feeding knowledge into a system that preferred preservation over proclamation. The Jesuit approach differed from empire. They did not claim land with swords, but with ink. Their maps were not declarations of conquest, but observations of reality. Yet, in the wrong hands, their knowledge could destabilize narratives of discovery. To reveal too much, too soon, would risk contradiction. And so their reports became part of the Vatican's hidden cartographic treasury knowledge, preserved but not shared. The silence is deliberate. The Jesuits saw too much too early. They mapped coastlines before explorers were ready to claim them. They recorded currents before empires understood their power. Their letters built a shadow map of the world that lay hidden beneath official atlases. In the end, the Jesuits were not silenced because they were wrong, but because they were too right. Their eyes saw a world larger, older, and more interconnected than the narrative of discovery allowed. The Vatican kept their knowledge safe but unseen. Today, their letters still rest in archives, their maps still folded in drawers. Their silence is not total. Fragments surface, hints escape, but the full weight of their observations remains guarded. The Jesuit eyes saw the world. The world has yet to fully see what they recorded. The Phoenicians were not a people of land, but of sea. Their cities clung to the edges of the Mediterranean, narrow strips of stone and harbour, but their ships spread outward like veins. They built vessels strong enough to endure storms, fast enough to outrun enemies, and clever enough to carry goods across continents. Their trade shaped empires, their alphabet shaped languages, and their voyages carried whispers that outlived them. Some of those whispers say they reached far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, westward into the great ocean. Stand on the deck of a Phoenician galley, its sails taut with wind, its oars steady in rhythm. The horizon stretches, not bounded by the Mediterranean's narrow walls, but by the vast Atlantic. The Canary Current pulls westward, steady as a hand. The North Equatorial Current follows, flowing toward distant shores. To a skilled sailor, these are not barriers, but invitations. And the Phoenicians were nothing if not skilled. Ancient historians hint at these voyages. Herodotus wrote of Phoenician sailors circumnavigating Africa under commission of Egyptian pharaohs. Carthaginian inscriptions speak of journeys beyond the known. Even fragments of coins, found in unexpected places, whisper of contacts across waters. Whether these accounts are memory or myth, they reveal the persistence of an idea. The Phoenicians may have gone further than history admits. In the Vatican archives, certain maps bear traces of coastlines that resemble not guesses, but echoes. Lines too early, too precise, too quiet. Some scholars believe these are remnants of knowledge carried forward from Phoenician charts long lost to time. A fragment survives here, a coastline there, copied into medieval maps without acknowledgement of its source. The origin fades, but the line persists. These are the Phoenician echoes, the faint traces of voyages erased from memory but preserved in silence. Why would such knowledge be hidden? Because it unsettles the story of discovery. If the Phoenicians reached the Americas long before Columbus, then the New World was never new. If they charted coasts of Africa or beyond, then later explorers did not discover but rediscovered. The narrative of conquest rests on the weight of originality. To admit echoes from the past undermines the claim of first arrival. Imagine a scribe in the Middle Ages copying a map. The coastline curves westward, unfamiliar but drawn with confidence. The scribe does not know its source. He only knows it belongs to an older chart. He copies it faithfully, as is his duty. In doing so, he preserves not only ink, but memory. The memory of a Phoenician sailor who traced that shore centuries before. The scribe cannot know, but the line survives, echoing through time. The silence around these echoes is thick. The Phoenicians left few written records. Their papyrus rotted, their libraries burned, their knowledge scattered. What remains are fragments, stone inscriptions, Greek accounts, Roman interpretations, and in the Vatican's forbidden maps, coastlines that may carry their memory. To lean over such a map is to feel the presence of sailors long gone. The lines whisper of ships that crossed horizons we thought uncrossed, of merchants who carried memory beyond the reach of empire. The echoes are faint, but they endure. They remind us that the sea does not forget, even when history does. The sagas tell of a man named Leif, son of Eric, who sailed west from Greenland. He found a land with grapes and forests, a place they called Vinland. The story has been told and retold, dismissed as legend, embraced as truth, doubted again, and finally affirmed when ruins at Lance Orcs Meadows revealed Norse presence in North America. Yet the sagas are more than stories. They are threads woven into maps, carried through silence, preserved in forbidden lines. The Norse were not strangers to distance. Their ships crossed the North Atlantic, linking Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. They followed currents, trusted stars, read the flight of birds. Their longships were swift and durable, built for coasts but capable of oceans. With such vessels, the journey west was not impossible. It was inevitable. On some medieval maps, faint coastlines appear west of Greenland. They are not labelled America nor even Vinland, but they resemble what we now know as Newfoundland and beyond. These coastlines are too vague to be proof, yet too consistent to be coincidence. They suggest knowledge carried forward, not through official channels, but through whispers of sagas, tales of sailors, and fragments of memory. The Vatican archives contain versions of these maps, often tucked away. The Church accepted the Norse sagas as tales, but not as history. To admit their truth would mean acknowledging discovery long before Columbus, long before papal decrees divided the world between crowns. The Norse thread unravelled the authority of later claims, so it was easier to let it remain legend. Imagine a cartographer in the 15th century hearing rumours of western lands. He has no proof, only sagas told by seamen who claim their ancestors saw distant shores. He sketches a faint coastline, unlabelled, just enough to mark possibility. That faint line is the Norse thread thin, fragile but persistent. Copied again and again, it survives into forbidden maps. The Norse thread is not loud. It does not declare itself with certainty. It weaves quietly through charts, appearing in fragments, disappearing in others. It is not proof, but presence. A reminder that memory moves differently than history, carried in stories, preserved in maps, whispered in silence. The ruins in Newfoundland prove the sagas held truth, but the maps suggest something more, that this truth was never entirely forgotten. It lingered in whispers, carried into monasteries, copied into charts, hidden in archives. The Norse thread runs through history, a quiet line connecting sagas to coastlines, memory to forbidden maps. To trace the Norse thread on parchment is to feel the weight of silence. It tells us that discovery is not a single act, but a woven fabric of memory. The Norse knew. They told their stories. The maps preserved their presence. The world simply chose to forget until the ruins forced us to remember. Across the Pacific, long before European ships carved their names into maps, Polynesian navigators moved with precision across thousands of miles of ocean. Their canoes carried families, crops, animals, culture, everything needed to settle new lands. They crossed distances that to modern eyes seem impossible, guided not by compass or chart, but by memory and training. Their wayfinding was an art, but it was also a science, older than parchment and more enduring than ink. A Polynesian navigator stands at the bow of his canoe. His eyes trace the stars, memorizing their rising and setting points. His hands feel the rhythm of the waves, subtle differences in swells that tell him of land beyond the horizon. He watches birds at dawn, their flight lines pointing toward nesting grounds. He tastes the wind, senses the colour of the water, listens to the silence of the ocean. Each sign is a word in a language the sea itself speaks, and he knows this language fluently. This knowledge was not written, but sung. It was carried in chants, in memory palaces of star lines, in oral traditions passed from master to apprentice. It required years of training, endless nights beneath the sky, patience, discipline, humility before the sea. It was not merely navigation, it was communion with the ocean itself. Some forbidden maps bear traces of Polynesian influence. Coastlines of distant islands appear centuries before European arrival. Currents are marked with unusual accuracy, as if drawn from knowledge that could only come from those who lived the sea daily. How did this knowledge enter European maps? Traders, missionaries, explorers all encountered Polynesians who carried in their memory maps vaster than any parchment. A fragment here, a detail there, whispered and copied, until their knowledge seeped silently into charts. The Vatican archives hold missionary reports from the Pacific, filled with descriptions of astonishing navigation, Priests wrote of men who could find islands invisible to outsiders, who spoke of lands stretching across horizons unmarked on European maps. These letters, preserved in silence, form another layer of forbidden cartography. The Polynesians did not draw maps, but their knowledge became maps, transcribed by those who did not fully understand what they were recording. Imagine a European cartographer receiving such reports. He reads of star lines, of swells, of distant islands reached without compass or chart. He cannot comprehend the method, but he copies the information. A line appears on his map where no European has sailed. It is accurate, yet unexplained. It becomes another forbidden fragment. The silence around Polynesian wayfinding is not erasure, but neglect. Europeans dismissed oral knowledge as primitive, even when it surpassed their own charts. The maps that bear Polynesian traces were hidden not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. They revealed that knowledge existed beyond Europe, older and deeper, unbound by parchment. To trace these lines on forbidden maps is to honour the navigators who carried the Pacific in their minds. Their canoes crossed oceans long before others dared. Their memory preserved coastlines that slipped quietly into European charts. Their wayfinding endures, a living science, still practiced, still sung, still guiding. The forbidden maps remind us the world was never unknown. It was always known by someone. The silence is not absence of knowledge, but absence of recognition. Polynesian navigators carried the world in their minds, and even in silence, their knowledge survived. A portolan is not a story. It does not explain, or argue, or wonder. It simply shows a network of lines radiating like webs, coastlines traced with precision, harbours marked with care. To hold one is to hold the sea itself, translated into ink. Yet in their silence, these maps speak louder than chronicles. They preserve details that should not exist for their age coastlines, drawn with uncanny accuracy, routes charted long before official voyages claimed them. They are silent witnesses, carrying truths no words dared to declare. The first portolans emerged in the 13th century, their origin too mysterious. Unlike earlier medieval maps, filled with theology and imagination, portolans were practical. They gave sailors what they needed: the shape of coasts, the orientation of harbours, the pull of winds. They were not philosophy, they were survival, which makes their accuracy more perplexing. Without longitude, without sextants, without satellites, the cartographers managed precision that rivals much later charts. How? The answer is not clear. Some say they were the inheritance of older knowledge. That fragments of charts, carried from forgotten civilizations, made their way into the hands of Mediterranean scribes. That Phoenician, echoes, Norse threads, or even more ancient memories slipped silently into these maps. The coastlines, copied faithfully without understanding their source, became part of a tradition. The portolans did not invent, they preserved. And in their preservation, they revealed. The Vatican holds collections of these maps, locked in drawers. Some bear coastlines that stretch too far south, too far west, too early. A Cape of Africa drawn centuries before exploration confirmed it. A suggestion of American shores before Columbus. These are not labelled discoveries. They are simply there, as if the sea had whispered its truth to the ink. The silence of the portolans is deliberate. They do not proclaim, they do not explain. They simply exist, witnesses to knowledge older than their makers. Their precision demands attention, but their lack of narrative allows dismissal. Coincidence, some say. Error, others argue. Yet the lines remain. They do not bend to dismissal. Imagine a sailor in the 14th century leaning over a portolan. His eyes follow the radiating lines. His hand traces the coast. He trusts the map because it works. He does not question why it is so accurate, why it shows what no one admits to knowing. For him, the map is a tool, not a puzzle. For us, it is the opposite. To study the Portolands today is to hear whispers of forgotten memory. They carry no voices, no explanations, but they preserve what words chose to silence. They are silent witnesses' ink that does not argue but does not lie, and in their silence they accuse history is not complete. Someone knew more earlier than we admit. A globe is a daring thing. Unlike a flat map, it declares the world whole. It demands coherence, no blank edges, no endless seas, no monsters at the margins. To create a globe is to claim knowledge of the earth entire, to wrap it in your hands as a sphere of certainty, which makes the forbidden globes of history all the more unsettling. Some were made centuries before the voyages that supposedly revealed their coasts. Some show lands that should not have been known. And yet, they exist, locked away or dismissed, their makers silent. In the 16th century, globes began to spread across Europe. They were objects of art as much as science, displayed in courts, admired by scholars. But among them are examples that defy official chronology. Globes that show America before it was named. Globes that hint at southern continents before exploration confirmed them. Globes that seem to preserve fragments of memory older than the age of discovery itself. The Vatican archives contain references to such objects. A globe from the early 1500s, its western shores too precise for its time. Another, showing a southern continent with bays and rivers, later found beneath Antarctic ice. These are not bold proclamations. They are curiosities, tucked into cabinets, mentioned in catalogues, but rarely displayed. Their presence is troubling, their implications too heavy. Better to admire their craftsmanship than to question their knowledge. The silence surrounding forbidden globes is deliberate. A flat map can be dismissed as error, a coastline excused as speculation. A globe cannot. It presents the earth as a whole, demanding belief in what it shows. A land drawn on a globe is not a suggestion but a certainty placed on the surface of the world itself, which is why such globes, if they carried forbidden knowledge, had to be hidden. Imagine a craftsman shaping a globe. He copies coastlines from fragments, from maps older than himself, from whispers preserved in ink. He does not know their source, he only knows they fit. He carves them into wood, paints them onto parchment, seals them with lacquer. The globe is beautiful, precise, mysterious. He presents it to a patron who admires its artistry, but frowns at its implications. The globe is admired, then stored. Too much knowledge, too early. The forbidden globes remind us that knowledge does not always arrive with discovery. Sometimes it lingers, preserved in fragments, waiting to be assembled. The globes assembled more than they should have. They stitched together pieces that hinted at lands yet unnamed, coasts yet unclaimed. And in doing so, they revealed more than history was ready to admit. To hold one is to feel the weight of silence. The world turns beneath your hand, complete, whole, unsettling. A globe is not a suggestion, it is a declaration, and these globes declare too much. America was not new when Columbus arrived. It was not empty, nor unseen, nor untouched. It was home to millions, civilizations older than Europe's medieval kingdoms, cultures with maps of their own maps written not on parchment but in memory, in trade routes, in oral tradition. Yet in European archives, America often appears not as discovery, but as shadow. Coastlines drawn before 1492, fragments of maps hinting at western lands, whispers preserved in ink but hidden in silence. The shadows of America appear in strange places. A chart from the 15th century shows a western coast, unlabelled. A globe suggests land beyond the Atlantic, unnamed but present. Portolands hint at islands too far west to be the Azores, too accurate to be fantasy. Each piece alone is deniable. Together, they form a shadow too consistent to ignore. The Vatican's role in these shadows is quiet but firm. As guardian of maps and manuscripts, it received fragments from across Europe. Some came from sailors' reports, others from traders' tales, others still from missionaries. Many hinted at lands across the Atlantic. The Church did not destroy these fragments. It preserved them, but in silence. To admit them openly would challenge the narrative of discovery, the authority of papal decrees that divided the New World between crowns. Better to let America remain in the shadows until the right moment. Imagine a scribe in the 15th century copying a map. His quill traces a coastline west of the Atlantic. He does not label it, he does not question it. It is simply part of the chart he copies. To him, it is detail. To us, it is shadow. The coastline endures without explanation, preserved in ink carried forward until Columbus's voyage gave it context. The silence around these shadows was not only about power, it was also about fear. To acknowledge America too soon was to risk chaos rival claims, fractured authority, disputes among crowns. Silence offered control. The shadows could remain until the narrative was ready. Yet the shadows persist. Even now, they whisper from maps tucked away in drawers. They tell us that America was known not as a bold discovery, but as a quiet memory. Known in fragments, in whispers, in coastlines, without names. Known enough to be drawn, but not enough to be declared. To study these maps is to confront the gap between knowledge and story. The coastlines were there, but the story was not told. The land was drawn, but the name was withheld. America existed in shadow until power chose to bring it into light. The forbidden maps remind us, discovery is not always about finding, but about declaring. America was not found in 1492. It was named, it was claimed, but in the shadows of archives, its presence had been there all along. To be a cartographer in the 15th or 16th century was to live in tension. One hand copied the lines that sailors swore were true. The other hand obeyed the patron who paid for the chart. The crown that demanded loyalty, the church that demanded order. To map the world was not only to describe it, but to declare how it should be seen. And when what the eyes revealed did not fit what the world was permitted to know, the cartographer faced a choice, truth or silence. The dilemma was not abstract. Imagine a man bent over parchment, his lamp guttering as midnight draws close. He has before him a fragment of a map, an older chart, passed through secret channels, showing a coastline west of the Atlantic. He knows no voyage has been proclaimed there, no crown has claimed it. Yet the fragment is too precise to be fantasy. He copies it carefully, the ink flowing in curves that match unknown shores. Then he pauses. Should he label it? Should he leave it blank? Should he adjust it to appear as error? Such choices determined what maps survived in the open, and which were hidden away. A coastline, drawn too clearly, could spark questions dangerous to both cartographer and patron. A chart showing Antarctica centuries too early could draw suspicion of heresy, even witchcraft. The safe path was compromise. Include the line, but leave it vague. Preserve the fragment, but disguise its significance. Or, in some cases, deliver a copy to those who asked for everything, the Vatican archivists who promised preservation in exchange for silence. The cartographer's dilemma is why so many forbidden maps survive as fragments. They were never bold declarations. They were quiet inclusions, half hidden, woven into larger works. A cape here, an island there, a line that curves too smoothly. The cartographer obeyed his duty to copy faithfully, but he also obeyed his duty to survive. Truth and silence, coexisting in the same ink. The Vatican understood these choices. It was not only an archive of knowledge, but a refuge for the dilemmas of cartographers. Maps too dangerous for public eyes could be surrendered, stored behind locked doors. There, the cartographer was freed from responsibility. He had preserved truth, but he had also preserved silence. His conscience was clear, his patron satisfied, his body safe. And yet, the lines he drew remain. Centuries later, we look at them and wonder, Who first saw that coast? Who traced that river? Who risked drawing what should not have been known? The cartographer's dilemma has become our puzzle. To hold one of these maps is to feel the tension still alive in its ink. The coastline whispers truth, but the blank space around it screams silence. The map is both revelation and concealment. The cartographer chose both, and so the forbidden map survives as a testament not only to forgotten voyages, but to the quiet courage of men who drew what they were not supposed to know. Knowledge does not vanish, it moves. When burned, it survives in memory. When banned, it survives in secret. When forbidden, it survives in shadow. Beneath monasteries, in the basements of noble houses, in trunks carried across seas, knowledge finds shelter. These are the shadow libraries, collections of maps, manuscripts, and fragments preserved outside official order, hidden from eyes that might destroy them. Some of these libraries were small, a single chest guarded by a family who feared confiscation. Others were vast, like the hidden collections of monasteries who copied texts forbidden by decree. In these shadows, forbidden maps often found refuge. A chart showing western lands before Columbus passed from sailor to monk to scholar, hidden in drawers, resurfacing decades later. A globe with a southern continent, wrapped in cloth, locked in a chest. A portolan bearing coastlines too precise, buried in a monastery cellar when inquisitors approached. The Vatican itself, paradoxically, became both guardian and rival of these shadow libraries. Some maps were surrendered to its archives, others escaped, preserved in silence by those unwilling to trust the Church's control. The shadow libraries were not coordinated. They were scattered, fragmented, fragile, but they ensured survival. Without them, many forbidden maps might have vanished entirely. Imagine a Jesuit scholar in the 17th century, copying a chart that arrived in secret. He knows it contradicts the narrative of discovery, but he cannot bring himself to destroy it. He hides it beneath a floorboard, where it remains until his death. Centuries later, the board creaks beneath a stranger's foot, the map discovered by accident. This is how knowledge moves, not in bold declarations, but in shadows, slipping through cracks of history. The existence of shadow libraries reminds us that silence was never complete. Even when institutions sought to control knowledge, fragments escaped. Even when maps were locked away, copies circulated quietly. Even when discoveries were proclaimed as first, whispers persisted that they were not. The shadows guarded truth, not for power, not for fame, but simply because to destroy knowledge felt wrong. Today, some of these shadow libraries are being rediscovered. Maps once thought lost emerge from private collections. Fragments surface in auctions. Letters hint at charts that still lie hidden. Each rediscovery reminds us that silence is never total. Knowledge waits, patient, in the shadows. The forbidden maps live because of these libraries. Without them, the Vatican's silence would have been final. With them, the fragments survived, preserved in darkness until time was ready to hear their whispers again. Silence is not absence, it is language. It has grammar, structure, meaning. To lock away a map is to speak a sentence of control. To leave a coastline unlabeled is to speak a word of caution. To allow fragments to exist but not explain them is to speak a phrase of ambiguity. The Vatican has spoken this language for centuries, guarding knowledge not by erasure but by silence. The language of silence is subtle. A catalogue entry notes a map but omits its troubling details. A scholar is granted access to a drawer but not to the one beside it. A coastline is preserved on parchment but stripped of context. The silence does not destroy, it suspends. It allows truth to exist, but only in fragments, only in whispers, only in places where few will hear. This silence is powerful. It has shaped history as much as any proclamation. By withholding forbidden maps, the Church controlled the narrative of discovery. It allowed crowns to claim lands as new, even when coastlines had been drawn centuries earlier. It preserved authority, not by denial, but by delay. Silence stretched time, postponing revelation, until it aligned with power. And yet, silence also preserves. Had the forbidden maps been destroyed, we would have nothing to study, nothing to question, nothing to suspect. Silence allowed them to endure, locked away, waiting. The language of silence is thus paradox. It hides, but it also protects. It controls, but it also preserves. Imagine walking the Vatican archives. The silence is not emptiness. It hums with presence. Each locked drawer, each unopened case, each catalogue entry with missing details is a sentence in this language. The archivists speak it fluently. They know how to preserve without revealing, how to acknowledge without explaining, how to let knowledge exist without letting it disrupt. The language of silence is the true guardian of forbidden maps. More effective than fire, more enduring than censorship, it has kept the fragments alive across centuries. It ensures that when doors finally open, when silence finally breaks, the maps will still be there, whispering their truths. To listen to this language requires patience. It is not spoken in words, but in absences, in coastlines unlabelled, in catalogues incomplete, in maps locked in drawers. To understand forbidden maps, one must learn to read silence itself. And when we do, we hear the message that has waited all along. The world was known in ways we have forgotten. The silence preserved it. The maps recorded it. And now, slowly, we are beginning to hear. Discovery, as we are taught, is sudden. A sailor sees land on the horizon, a shout rings out, and history changes in an instant. But discovery in practice is rarely like this. It is orchestrated, prepared, timed, announced when it benefits those in power. And in this orchestration, silence plays as important a role as revelation. Forbidden maps, preserved but hidden, made discovery less about finding and more about declaring. Consider Columbus. His voyage in 1492 is remembered as bold, uncertain, a leap into the unknown. Yet, whispers suggest he may have carried fragments of maps, hints of western shores, whispers of lands already drawn in silence. If so, his discovery was not chance but choreography. The coastline existed in archives long before the ships sailed. What Columbus did was bring it into narrative, place it in the service of crowns and papal decrees. Discovery became a performance staged for history. This orchestration required silence, maps showing western lands before Columbus had to remain hidden. Their existence would undermine the performance, spoil the script. For discovery to be declared new, earlier whispers had to be quiet. The Vatican's role was crucial here. By preserving forbidden maps in locked drawers, it ensured the performance could unfold cleanly. The actors took the stage at the right time, while the silent witnesses of earlier knowledge waited in the wings. Imagine an archive drawer in the late 15th century. Inside lies a map showing a vague western coast. The archivist knows what it implies, but he does not speak. Instead, he watches as Columbus sails, as Spain and Portugal divide the seas, as papal bulls draw lines across oceans. Only then, when authority has secured itself, might the drawer be opened again. The silence was part of the orchestration. This is how discovery becomes narrative, not by accident, not by pure chance, but by arrangement. The world was known in fragments long before it was declared whole. But the fragments were kept quiet until power was ready to claim them. Discovery, then, is less about knowledge than about timing, less about what was seen than about when it was allowed to be spoken. The forbidden maps remind us of this orchestration. They show coastlines drawn centuries before discovery. They prove the knowledge existed, even if it was not declared. Their silence was deliberate, their preservation intentional. And when we look at them now, we see not just what was hidden, but why. Discovery is performance. The script was written in archives, rehearsed in silence, and staged upon the sea. The applause of history was never for the first to know, but for the first to declare. Memory does not obey borders. It flows, carried in stories, in songs, in maps, in silence. It outlives empires, crosses oceans, survives fire and censorship. Forbidden maps are memory given shape in ink, fragments of truths that persisted even when history tried to forget. To study them is to feel the weight of memory pressing against silence. Each map is more than a chart. It is a vessel of memory, a coastline copied from an older source, a river drawn from a sailor's tale, a cape preserved from a voyage long forgotten. The memory may not be complete, but it is there, stubborn, insistent. It demands to be preserved, even if only in shadow. The Vatican understood the weight of memory. It could not destroy it without risk, for memory resisted destruction. Better to contain it, to preserve it in silence. And so the archives became a mausoleum of memory maps, resting like bones, fragments preserved like relics, waiting for centuries in the dark. But memory is never truly still. It seeps through cracks, surfaces in whispers, reappears in unexpected places. A forgotten map emerges from a monastery chest. A fragment resurfaces in a scholar's notes. A coastline hidden in an archive is copied into a chart that survives the centuries. Memory persists. Imagine standing before one of these maps. The ink is faded, the parchment brittle. At first glance, it is ordinary. Then you notice a coastline drawn centuries too early. You feel the weight of memory pressing through the silence, whispering of sailors who saw what they were not meant to speak. The map does not shout, it whispers, but the whisper is heavy, undeniable. The weight of memory challenges us. It reminds us that history is selective, that what we call discovery is often rediscovery, that silence is never absence. The forbidden maps exist because memory insisted on being preserved, even when power tried to bury it. To carry this weight is to accept uncertainty, to admit that our story of the world is incomplete, to recognize that beneath the silence lies a deeper truth. The forbidden maps are heavy, not because of their ink, but because of the memory. They carry memory of a world known long before we admitted it. In the end, memory always finds a way. The maps survived centuries of silence, and now they speak again. Their weight is ours to bear, and in bearing it, we glimpse the world as it truly was. Older, wider, more connected than we were taught to believe. In the Vatican archives, there are doors few have opened, drawers few have touched. Behind them lie maps that may never see light, fragments still preserved in silence. These are the last locked drawers, the final guardians of knowledge, forbidden to history. Whether they hold coastlines of Antarctica before its discovery, charts of America before Columbus, or other fragments we cannot imagine, we do not know. Their silence is complete. The last locked drawer is more than wood and metal. It is symbol. It represents the boundary between what is preserved and what is revealed, between what we are allowed to know and what remains hidden. It reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what was permitted to be spoken. Imagine standing in that archive, the drawer before you, the key heavy in your hand. You know inside lies parchment that could alter history, challenge certainty, reshape memory. Do you open it? Do you break centuries of silence? Or do you leave it closed, respecting the caution of those who came before? The choice is not simple, for to reveal is to disrupt. To admit Antarctica was mapped before discovery is to challenge science and history alike. To show America drawn before Columbus is to unravel the narrative of empire. To reveal too much, too suddenly risks chaos. This is why the drawer remains locked. But the forbidden maps within it remind us of something greater. That knowledge is never truly destroyed. That silence is never eternal. That one day, the drawer may open, and the world may see what has been hidden. The last locked drawer is not only in the Vatican. It exists in every archive, every collection, every shadow library. It exists in the silence between what we know and what we suspect. It exists in the tension between truth and power, and it waits, patient, for the moment when silence ends. The forbidden maps are not just relics of the past, they are promises of the future, promises that memory cannot be erased, that truth cannot be buried forever, that one day the drawer will open. And when it does, the world we thought we knew will widen, deepen, change. Until then, we live with silence. We walk through history knowing it is incomplete, knowing fragments remain hidden, knowing the last locked drawer still waits. And perhaps that is the final lesson of forbidden maps, that the world is always larger than the stories we tell, that memory is always older than history, and that silence itself is part of the map, guiding us toward truths yet to be revealed. The drawer remains locked, the key remains hidden, the silence remains unbroken, but the maps wait, patient as the sea, certain as the stars. And one day, when the drawer opens, the world will discover, not for the first time, but again. An archive is not kept alive by parchment alone. It breathes through its custodians, the men and women who dust shelves, turn keys, repair bindings, copy catalogues. They do not write history, yet they hold it in their hands daily. And in their silence lies a power almost as great as that of the maps themselves. For they are the ones who decide what gathers dust in darkness and what finds its way into the light. Imagine a young custodian in the 17th century, newly appointed to the Vatican archives. He expects books, scrolls, and neat order. Instead, he finds silence heavy as stone. He is given keys to rooms he may never enter, drawers he may never unlock. His duty is to clean, preserve, catalogue, but never question. One day, his supervisor gestures to a heavy case on the shelf. "That drawer," the older man whispers, "you will dust it, but you will not open it. It holds things not meant for us." And so the young custodian learns the first lesson of silence. Over years, custodians witness fragments. A corner of a parchment slipping from its case, revealing lines too clean to be speculation. A chart briefly unrolled for repair, showing coasts that history says were unknown. They see, but they do not speak. Their role is not to interpret, but to preserve. Yet each custodian carries memory, and that memory lingers even when maps are locked away. In their diaries, those that survive, we find hints. A note about an unfamiliar coastline, a description of a chart with strange southern lands. They never name the maps, never copy them, but they acknowledge their presence. These diaries, scattered across time, are like faint echoes of forbidden maps themselves, fragments, incomplete, whispering of what lies hidden. The custodians of dust kept silence not out of ignorance, but out of duty. Their loyalty was not to curiosity, but to order. Yet without them, the forbidden maps would not exist today. They would have crumbled, burned, or been lost. The custodians, in their quiet obedience, became the unacknowledged guardians of forbidden truth. To imagine them is to see the paradox. A man dusts a drawer containing a map that could rewrite history. He does not open it, does not copy it, does not question it. Yet his hands, by preserving the wood and parchment, ensure that centuries later the map still waits. He obeys silence, and in doing so ensures that silence is not destruction but preservation. The forbidden maps live because of these silent custodians. They are the hands that carried dust away so truth could remain. They spoke the language of silence fluently, not in words but in care. Their legacy is not in declarations but in fragments preserved, waiting for us to discover what they guarded so faithfully. But not all obeyed. Among the scribes and copyists who worked in shadowed rooms, some could not resist the temptation to preserve more than they were ordered to. A coastline too compelling, a fragment too precise sometimes, instead of copying faithfully for the archives, they made private copies, quiet reproductions, hidden in personal notebooks, smuggled into shadow libraries. These disobedient copyists became the secret link between forbidden maps and the outside world. Imagine a scribe in the late 15th century, tasked with copying a chart for cataloguing. He spreads the parchment, traces the lines, ink flowing steadily. But when his supervisor steps away, he makes a second tracing, small enough to hide in his robes. He carries it home, rolls it tightly, and slips it beneath a floorboard. He knows the risk. To be caught is to face punishment, even death. But he cannot bear to see the map vanish into silence. His disobedience is preservation of another kind. Such fragments surface centuries later. A copy of a coastline in a scholar's private notebook, its ink younger than the map it echoes. A strange chart appearing in a collection far from Rome, its provenance uncertain, but its lines unmistakably older. These are the fingerprints of disobedient copyists. They disobeyed the silence, not by declaring truth openly, but by ensuring it would not be entirely lost. The Vatican knew such risks. Rules were strict, supervision constant, yet no system is perfect. Curiosity is stronger than obedience for some, and the maps themselves exert a pull too strong to resist. Forbidden knowledge invites guardians, but it also invites thieves, not thieves of gold, but of memory. We cannot name most of them. Their work was hidden, their identities erased by time, but the survival of certain forbidden maps outside the Vatican walls suggests they existed. Without them, the shadows might be darker, the silence more complete. Their quiet defiance kept the thread alive, ensuring fragments reached scholars, collectors, and eventually, us. The disobedient copyists remind us that history is not only shaped by those in power, but by those who resisted in silence. They did not stage revolutions or write manifestos, they simply made copies. And in those copies, they preserved the possibility of remembering. To imagine them is to honour their risk. A man hunched over parchment, heart pounding, copying a coastline he is forbidden to acknowledge. A woman cataloguing maps, slipping a note into her diary with a sketch of a strange southern land. Each act of disobedience is small, almost invisible, but together they form the fragile bridge by which forbidden maps crossed centuries of silence to reach us. They remind us that silence can be broken not by shouts, but by whispers, not by defiance in public, but by ink scratched quietly in the dark. Long before maps, the sea was the first archive. Its currents are unchanged, its stars unshifting, its winds faithful to their seasons. Sailors come and go, empires rise and fall, maps are drawn and hidden, but the sea remains, and the sea remembers. Every voyage leaves a trace, not on parchment, but in the rhythm of waves, in the stories of sailors, in the knowledge passed from generation to generation. Imagine the Polynesian navigator, reading swells with his skin, tracing star lines with his memory. Imagine the Norse sailor, trusting birds to lead him toward land. Imagine the Phoenician merchant, following currents westward beyond the Pillars of Hercules. None of them left maps we can hold, but the sea remembers them. Their knowledge lingers in forbidden coastlines, in whispers copied into charts, in fragments preserved in silence. When we look at forbidden maps, we are not only seeing ink, we are seeing the sea's memory translated into human lines. A coastline too early, a cape too precise, a river hidden beneath Antarctic ice. These are not just cartographic puzzles, they are echoes of the sea itself, remembering voyages long forgotten. The Vatican, for all its silence, became an unwilling custodian of this memory. Its locked drawers and guarded maps are like the deep ocean trenches, silent, dark, but preserving traces of everything that passes. The silence does not erase, it suspends, and in suspension, memory survives. The sea reminds us that discovery is not ownership. It is participation in an endless cycle of knowing and forgetting, remembering and silencing. No one truly discovered America or Antarctica or the Pacific. They were known, forgotten, remembered again. The maps we call forbidden are simply the moments when the sea's memory surfaced in ink before power was ready to acknowledge it. To walk by the ocean today is to feel this continuity. The same stars shine, the same currents flow, the same winds pull. The sea is still the map, still the memory, still the archive older than any Vatican drawer. And when we study forbidden maps, we are not uncovering new knowledge, we are listening to the sea remembering. The forbidden maps whisper that silence is temporary, memory is eternal. The sea remembers what we forget. The coastlines survive in ink because they survive in waves. And no matter how long the drawers remain locked, no matter how long silence is preserved, the sea will always hold the truth. The custodians may guard it, the copyists may steal it, the archives may silence it, but the sea remembers. And in that memory lies the certainty that truth, however long delayed, will always find its way back into light. The most dangerous truths do not live in the centre of maps, they live in the margins. In the blank spaces where scribes added notes, where cartographers sketched small symbols, where whispers of knowledge hid themselves in plain sight. These margins, often ignored by readers eager for coastlines and routes, hold fragments of forbidden memory. They are the quiet corners where the world slipped through silence. Consider a 15th century chart. Its coastlines are familiar, its compass roses bold, its trade routes clear. At first glance, nothing unusual. But in the margin, a faint sketch of an island that does not exist on any other map, or a Latin phrase, hastily scrawled, terra ultra mare land beyond the sea. These words are not declarations, they are suggestions. They allow the cartographer to preserve what he has heard without staking his reputation. If challenged, he can say it was speculation, rumour, an idle note. But if left untouched, the margin becomes a vessel of memory. The Vatican archives preserve many such margins. Maps catalogued as ordinary reveal, upon close study, faint notes of coastlines that history says should not exist. Sometimes it is a line, sometimes a phrase, sometimes an unfamiliar symbol. These are the fingerprints of knowledge too fragile to be spoken openly, too insistent to be forgotten. Imagine a cartographer copying a map late at night. He has been ordered to reproduce it faithfully, leaving no additions. Yet as his quill hovers, he recalls a sailor's tale of distant shores, or a fragment of a chart he once glimpsed in the archives. He hesitates, then, in the margin, he sketches a faint line. It is small enough to escape notice, but large enough to survive. He closes the map and delivers it. No one questions the margin. And, centuries later, we find it, whispering of truths hidden in silence. The margins are where forbidden maps survive most clearly, not as bold coastlines, but as hints, shadows, suggestions. They are the places where cartographers wrestled with the dilemma of truth and obedience. They could not declare, but they could suggest. They could not reveal, but they could hint. The margins became their compromise. To study these margins is to enter the world of whispers. Each note is a fragment of a story untold, each sketch a memory preserved against erasure. Together they form a hidden layer of cartography, a shadow archive written not in bold lines but in faint gestures. The forbidden maps are not only in drawers and locked cases, they are also in the margins, waiting for those who know how to read silence. And in those margins, the world reveals itself not whole, not complete, but in fragments, stubborn enough to survive centuries of control. Antarctica is the most silent continent. It hides beneath ice miles thick, its mountains buried, its valleys concealed. For centuries, it was unknown, unseen, untouched. Yet on certain forbidden maps, Antarctica appears outlined centuries before its official discovery. How could ice so vast, so silent, be drawn before anyone had set foot upon it? The question lingers like a shadow across history. The Piri-Reis map of 1513 is the most famous. On its parchment, drawn by an Ottoman admiral, the southern continent appears not a blank mass of ice, but coastlines, bays, rivers. Some argue it is coincidence, others that it is misinterpreted, but the lines are too precise, too deliberate. They resemble not the frozen wasteland we see today, but the coastline beneath the ice, as revealed only by modern satellites. If true, then someone knew Antarctica not as a prison of glaciers, but as land uncovered. How? Theories abound. Some suggest ancient civilizations saw it before the ice thickened. Others claim sailors reached it during a rare season, when coasts lay bare. Perhaps fragments of maps from forgotten ages survived, copied into later charts without understanding. The Vatican archives, it is said, contain versions of these maps' parchments, showing southern lands centuries before Cook, before Bellingshausen, before the 19th century opened the frozen world to sight. Imagine a Jesuit scholar in the 17th century, unrolling such a map in a quiet study. His candle flickers over coastlines he cannot comprehend. He knows no ship has been there, no voyage recorded. Yet the lines are precise. He copies them carefully, then rolls the map again, filing it in silence. He cannot explain it, but he cannot erase it. The silence of ice becomes the silence of archives. Antarctica challenges the narrative of discovery more than any other land. America was at least reachable, visited, whispered of. But Antarctica, how could anyone know it? To admit knowledge of it before its discovery is to admit a civilization capable of charting coasts we barely understand even today. The silence protects us from the implications, but the maps persist. They whisper that the ice has not always hidden what it hides now. They suggest memory older than our recorded history, knowledge passed through fragments, preserved in margins, guarded in drawers. The silence of Antarctica is not only in its ice, it is in our refusal to ask how such maps could exist. The forbidden maps remind us that the world is larger than our stories. Antarctica's silence is not absence, but presence too vast to confront. The ice conceals, but it also preserves. And in the archives, the maps do the same. Together, ice and silence hold a truth we are not yet ready to face. History remembers the explorers, the kings, the conquerors. It forgets the mapmakers. Their hands traced the world, their ink gave shape to memory, their silence preserved truths hidden from power. Yet, somewhere, in some forgotten room, there was a last mapmaker, the one who drew the final forbidden map, the one who knew the silence would soon swallow all. Imagine him in the 18th century, when science and empire were advancing, when maps became instruments of conquest rather than whispers of memory. He sits at his desk, surrounded by fragments, older charts with coastlines drawn centuries too early, margins filled with symbols no one dares interpret, globes showing southern lands. He has studied them all, copied them, preserved them, and now he knows his work will be the last. The world is changing. Empires demand certainty, not whispers. Science demands proof, not fragments. The old maps, with their mysterious coastlines and forbidden hints, are being dismissed as errors, discarded as curiosities. The last mapmaker realizes that silence is winning. Soon the drawers will close forever. The fragments will remain locked, their whispers too faint to be heard. And so he makes one final map, not for kings, not for scholars, but for memory itself. He gathers the fragments, the western coasts, drawn before Columbus, the southern lands before Cook, the rivers hidden beneath Antarctic ice. He draws them all together, not labelling, not explaining, but preserving. It is not a map of certainty, but of whispers, not of science, but of memory. He rolls it, seals it, hides it, perhaps in the Vatican archives, perhaps in a shadow library, perhaps it is lost forever. The last mapmaker is not remembered. His name is forgotten, his map unseen, but his act is what gives us the forbidden maps we puzzle over today. Without him, the fragments might have vanished entirely. With him, they survive, waiting for us to listen. To imagine him is to understand the paradox of forbidden maps. They exist because someone chose silence, but also because someone chose preservation. They are both hidden and revealed, both forgotten and remembered. The last mapmaker embodies this paradox. His silence preserved, his ink revealed, his memory waits. Perhaps his map is still locked in a drawer, dust gathering on its case. Perhaps it lies in a chest beneath a monastery floor. Perhaps one day it will surface, altering everything we believe about history. Until then, the last mapmaker remains a figure of silence, unknown, unseen, but essential. The forbidden maps are his legacy. They remind us that knowledge is fragile, that memory depends on those who choose to preserve, even when forbidden. The last mapmaker knew this. He drew his final lines, not for his time, but for ours, and in doing so, he ensured that silence would not have the final word. The last mapmaker has no monument, no statue, no chronicle, but his monument is the forbidden maps themselves. Each coastline drawn too early, each margin filled with whispers, each fragment preserved in silence is his memorial. He is the custodian of memory, the guardian of whispers, the last to draw the world as it truly was. And though we do not know his name, we know his work. We see it every time we look at the maps that should not exist and yet do. Fire is the oldest censor. It consumes quickly, leaving only smoke, ash, and the illusion of finality. Kings have burned heretical books. Emperors have torched libraries. Inquisitors have consigned forbidden writings to flames. And yet, memory resists. Even burned maps leave echoes, traces in letters, fragments in copies, whispers in margins. To destroy knowledge is never as simple as fire pretends. Imagine the flames of the 17th century, licking at parchment as officials toss errors into the pyre. A map showing a western coast before Columbus, dismissed as fantasy, destroyed before it spreads doubt. Another chart with a southern continent, too precise for its time, condemned as superstition. The fire consumes them, but not completely. A custodian remembers the lines. A copyist preserves a sketch in his notebook. A scholar writes a description in a letter. The flames take the ink, but not the memory. The Vatican archives hold catalogues of items once present, now missing. Some are noted as lost to fire, others as removed. These gaps are as revealing as the maps themselves. For each absence hints at what once existed maps that challenged narratives, destroyed not because they were wrong, but because they were too right. Fire ensured they could not be proclaimed, but silence ensured they were not entirely forgotten. The echo of burned maps survives in strange ways. A later cartographer, copying from memory, reproduces a coastline he once saw on a chart that no longer exists. His map, dismissed as speculative, carries forward the echo of the one destroyed. A margin note in a scholar's diary describes a southern land most curious, likely referring to a map since burned. A Jesuit letter mentions charts of the West, older than our discovery, their originals now ashes. To study forbidden maps is to study these echoes. They are incomplete, fragile, uncertain, but they prove that destruction is never final. Memory slips through fire like smoke. It lingers in lungs, in clothes, in whispers. Burned maps still breathe, faintly, in the archives of silence. The echo of burned maps reminds us that fire cannot erase truth. It can only delay it. The sea remembers, the stars remain, the coastlines wait. The maps may be ashes, but the knowledge persists. And in the fragments that survive, the echo grows louder, refusing to be silenced. Every age has its heretics. Some deny doctrine, some defy authority, some question the very structure of power. In the world of maps, heretics were those who drew what they were not supposed to. They sketched coastlines that challenged narratives, recorded routes that threatened empires, preserved memories that crowns and churches preferred to forget. For this, they faced silence, exile, sometimes worse. Imagine a 16th century cartographer in Portugal. He has seen fragments of a chart showing Brazil before Cabral, America before Columbus. He copies it, carefully, weaving the forbidden coastline into his map. His patrons frown. Too much detail, too soon. He insists it is accurate. They whisper of heresy. He is dismissed, his maps confiscated. His work disappears into drawers, labelled error, preserved in silence. Or picture a French scholar in the 17th century, publishing a globe with a southern continent that resembles Antarctica. He claims it is speculation, but his precision betrays older knowledge. His colleagues laugh, accuse him of deceit. His globe is quietly removed, his name forgotten, his work filed away. A cartographic heretic, remembered only in fragments. The Vatican archives preserve these heretics indirectly. Their names appear in marginal notes, their maps catalogued but withheld, their works marked as not to circulate. Their crime was not falsehood but premature truth. They saw too much, too early, and refused to remain silent. For this, they were silenced. Yet, their defiance lingers. In every forbidden map, we see the shadow of a heretic who refused to obey. In every coastline drawn before its time, we glimpse the courage of someone who chose ink over obedience. They did not change history in their lifetimes, but they preserved memory for ours. Heretics are necessary. They remind us that truth often begins in whispers, in fragments, in defiance. They suffer in silence, but their work survives. And when we look at forbidden maps today, we see not only coastlines and rivers, but also the courage of those who drew them against the will of power. The cartographic heretics stand as silent witnesses, ink-stained rebels whose lines endured when their voices did not. Their maps are their testimony, preserved in silence, waiting for us to read. Among whispers of forbidden maps, one story persists, the tale of a map so precise, so impossible, that even those who guard it cannot explain it. A map that shows both Americas in detail centuries before Columbus, Antarctica's coasts free of ice, Pacific islands traced with accuracy. A map that should not exist. We do not know if it is real. Some say it lies in the deepest Vatican drawer, shown only to a handful of scholars sworn to silence. Others claim it was destroyed, though copies may linger in shadow libraries. A few insist it surfaces from time to time, mistaken for a later chart, dismissed by those who cannot believe what they see. Imagine such a map, unrolled across a table, its parchment yellowed but its lines crisp. North and South America stretch across the page, rivers marked, mountains drawn. To the south, Antarctica curves in bays and peninsulas, hidden beneath today's ice. Across the Pacific, islands dot the waves in patterns Polynesian navigators knew, but Europeans had not yet charted. The map is not fantasy. It is accurate, precise, undeniable, and it predates every official discovery. If such a map exists, its implications are profound. It suggests a civilization with knowledge far beyond what we admit, a memory preserved across centuries, fragments carried through sailors, traders, priests, copyists. It suggests the world was known long before it was declared discovered. It collapses the narrative of empire, erodes the authority of conquest, and reveals history as incomplete. This is why it must remain hidden. To reveal it would be to undo centuries of story. To admit it would be to admit that silence has shaped history more than truth. Better to keep it locked away, preserved but unseen, a relic of a memory too dangerous to confront. And yet the whispers persist. Scholars hint at maps they have glimpsed but cannot publish. Letters mention charts too advanced for their time. Fragments surface in unexpected places, too precise to dismiss. Together, they suggest that the impossible map may not be myth, but memory. The map that should not exist is more than parchment. It is symbol. It represents all forbidden maps, the coastlines too early, the rivers too precise, the fragments too persistent. It embodies the silence of archives, the defiance of heretics, the courage of custodians and copyists. Whether it lies hidden in a Vatican drawer or only in our imagination, it forces us to ask, what do we not know? What is still locked away? Perhaps one day it will surface. Perhaps it already has, unnoticed in plain sight. Or perhaps it will remain forever in silence, a secret preserved until the world is ready. Until then, it haunts us, whispering from the margins, reminding us that history is not what we are told, but what we choose to hear. The map that should not exist is the final paradox. It should not be real, yet it is remembered. It should not be hidden, yet it is preserved. It should not exist, and yet it does. And in its silence lies the most dangerous truth of all. There are two kinds of geography, the geography of the world and the geography of silence. One maps rivers, mountains, coasts. The other maps absences, what is not said, what is not shown, what is preserved but never revealed. Forbidden maps belong to both. They trace the earth, but they also trace silence, showing us not only what was known but what was hidden. Imagine standing in a library, surrounded by globes and charts. At first, the geography is obvious. Coastlines inked in bold lines, cities marked with dots, seas coloured in blue. But if you look closer, another geography appears. A missing coastline where it should be drawn, a label erased, a section blank, though whispers suggest it was once filled. These blanks are not mistakes. They are deliberate. They mark the geography of silence. The Vatican archives are full of this second geography. A map catalogued but never shown. A coastline described in a letter but missing from the chart it references. An entire drawer marked with a number but its contents absent from the index. These are coordinates of silence. They tell us where knowledge was buried, where memory was withheld, where truth was suspended. The geography of silence is harder to read than that of rivers and coasts. It requires patience, imagination, trust in whispers. It is a map made not of lines, but of gaps. Yet it reveals as much as the geography of the world itself. For silence is not emptiness. It is presence withheld. It marks the edges of control, the boundaries of power, the limits of what was permitted. To study forbidden maps is to walk both geographies at once. The coastline drawn centuries too early is geography of the world. The missing label beside it is geography of silence. Together, they tell the full story, not just of what was known, but of how knowledge was managed, shaped, silenced. The geography of silence stretches beyond the Vatican. It exists in every archive, every library, every place where knowledge is preserved but not declared. It is the blank page, the missing record, the drawer that will not open. To ignore it is to see only half the map. To read it is to understand how deeply silence has shaped our memory of the world. Forbidden maps are coordinates of this geography. They point not only to coasts and lands, but to the silences that preserved them. They remind us that history is not simply what was seen, but what was allowed to be spoken.